I sat in the back of the courtroom with my hands folded in my lap and watched my mother-in-law cry into a handkerchief while describing me to a judge as erratic, delusional, and a danger to the family's legacy. She wore pearl earrings and a navy blazer, the picture of a grieving, responsible matriarch. My sister-in-law sat beside her, dabbing her eyes on cue. My husband was 3 rows ahead of me, staring at the floor, and I had not spoken a single word in my own defense since the hearing began. I pressed 2 fingers against the small silver locket resting at my collarbone and thought, keep going. Before I tell you what happened when my attorney stood up, I need to take you back 8 months. To the afternoon I sat in a leather chair in an estate attorney's office in Charleston and learned that my father-in-law had rewritten his will 3 weeks before he died. My father-in-law was not a war man. He was a civil engineer who had spent 40 years building bridges in places most people only saw on maps. He had calloused hands and very few words, and the only time I ever saw him genuinely at ease was when he walked through the Hargrove house. That was what everyone called it, the name it had carried since it was built in 1887. A 3-story Victorian on the edge of the historic district, wrapped in a wide front porch, with original heart pine floors and plaster medallion ceilings that had been slowly dissolving under decades of neglect. When I married into the family 6 years ago, the house was already in bad shape. My father-in-law had inherited it from his own father and never touched it. Not because he didn't love it, but because he didn't know how. I was an interior architectural designer. I knew how. For 4 years, I put everything I had into that house. I sourced period-accurate hardware from estate sales in Georgia and Virginia. I spent 3 months tracking down a craftsman in Savannah who still knew how to repair horsehair plaster. I rebuilt the back staircase by hand with my father-in-law watching from a folding chair in the hallway, handing me tools and not saying much, which was his version of expressing deep appreciation. The house became something, not just beautiful, alive. Historic preservation groups came to photograph it. A magazine wrote about the restoration. My father-in-law framed the article and hung it in the front parlor. My mother-in-law never set foot in it during the restoration. She had moved to Hilton Head 15 years ago after the divorce and referred to the house as that money pit in a tone that made it clear she thought anyone who cared about it was foolish. So when the estate attorney opened the folder and read the terms of the will, the silence in that room had texture. My father-in-law left the Hargrove house to me, solely and entirely to me, including all furnishings, all restoration investments, and a separate trust earmarked specifically for its continued maintenance. My husband received a cash inheritance and the investment accounts. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law, who had been included in a previous version of the will, received nothing from the property. I felt my husband go very still beside me. I felt my mother-in-law's gaze move to the side of my face like something with weight. The estate attorney cleared his throat and added that there was a protective covenant attached to the property deed. Any documented attempt to contest ownership, damage the property, or coerce the named heir into relinquishing title would result in immediate forfeiture of all other inheritance rights held by any family member who participated. My father-in-law had written that clause himself. I found out later he had added it to the document 11 days before he died. He knew. The drive home was quiet. My husband didn't reach for my hand. He stared out the passenger window the entire way, and I understood that something had already shifted inside him. Some tectonic thing I couldn't see yet, but could feel beneath everything. My mother-in-law called that evening. I heard my husband's half of the conversation from the kitchen while I was washing dishes. The way his voice got low and careful. The way he said, "I know," twice in the same minute. After he hung up, he came and stood in the kitchen doorway and said she was upset. He said she felt blindsided. He said she wanted to talk. I dried my hands on a dish towel and said, "She can talk to her attorney." He looked at me like he didn't recognize me. I looked back like I recognized him perfectly. My mother-in-law didn't wait for a formal conversation. She arrived at our house 2 days later with my sister-in-law and a man I had never met who was introduced as a family financial advisor. Though he had no business cards and never spoke, they sat in our living room, and my mother-in-law explained, with the practiced patience of someone who had rehearsed this in a mirror, that the house needed to be liquidated. She said she and my father-in-law had discussed it before the divorce, that there was an understanding, that the property was always meant to serve the whole family. She said the market was favorable. She said my husband would benefit from the equity, and that she and my sister-in-law deserved their share of what had been a family asset for generations. I sat across from her and let her finish. Then I said that the house was mine, that I had spent 4 years and a substantial amount of my own professional savings restoring it, and that I had no intention of selling it. I told her I was planning to apply for a historic preservation grant and open the ground floor to small cultural events and artist residencies, something the neighborhood wanted for years. My sister-in-law made it sound like a laugh that wasn't. My mother-in-law looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something flat and assessing. The performance stripped off for just a moment. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and said, "We'll see about that." That was on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, my husband and I had our first real fight. It started quietly, the way the worst fights do. He said he thought I was being inflexible. I said I thought he was letting his mother speak for him. He said his mother had a point about the family history of the house. I said the house had no legal history with her, only with me. He said I was making things adversarial when they didn't have to be. I asked him if he had ever considered that maybe they already were adversarial and he just hadn't been willing to see it. He slept in the guest room that night. I lay in our bed and stared at the ceiling and understood something that had been trying to surface for years. My husband was a good man in most of the ways that counted, but he had never fully left his mother's house. Not in the way that mattered. He had moved his body across state lines and started a life with me, but some essential part of him was still the boy who needed her approval, who flinched when she disapproved, who would bend truth slightly sideways to avoid her displeasure. I thought about my father-in-law, who had also started as that boy, and wondered what it had cost him to finally see her clearly. I wondered if he had left the house to me precisely because he knew I was the only one who wouldn't fold. The incident happened 3 weeks later. I had been spending most evenings at the Hargrove house, cataloging the original hardware and preparing documents for the preservation grant application. My home office at our house held the master files, all my architectural drawings, the restoration photography, the provenance documentation for the fixtures, years of meticulous records. I came home on a Wednesday night and found the door to my office standing open. My first thought was that I had left it ajar. Then I stepped inside and smelled it, a chemical sharpness underneath the familiar scent of old paper and drafting pencils. Like cleaning solvent, but wrong somehow, too sweet. My hard drive had been removed from my desktop computer. 3 of my flat file drawers had been rifled through, the contents pulled out and repiled in disorder. Several of my original restoration drawings, the ones I had done by hand, were damaged, water, or something like water poured across the surface, blurring the ink in long diagonal streaks. I stood in the middle of the room with my keys still in my hand and did not move for a long time. My husband was home. He had been home all evening. He said he had heard nothing. He stood in the doorway behind me and said it might have been a break-in. We should call the police. This was a terrible violation. How upsetting. He put his hand on my shoulder, and I felt something in his touch that wasn't quite right, a flatness where comfort should have been. I called my attorney instead of the police. She told me to document everything photographically, touch nothing else, and come see her in the morning. That night, after my husband fell asleep, I sat on the edge of our bathtub and thought carefully. The front door had not been forced. Nothing of monetary value was taken, not the laptop, not the camera equipment, not the small amount of cash I kept in a desk drawer for supply runs. What was taken was documentation. What was damaged was irreplaceable, hand-drawn work. Whoever did this understood what mattered in that office, and whoever did this had a key. My attorney was already suspicious when I arrived the next morning. She had been practicing estate litigation for 22 years, and she recognized the shape of what was happening. She used the word pressure campaign and told me to start being very careful about what I said, to whom, and where. She told me to assume that anything I said inside my own home could be heard. I drove to the Hargrove house afterward and sat in the front parlor for 2 hours. The light came through the restored window glass at an angle that made the heart pine floors look like amber. I had put 3 years of my life into this room, and I knew every inch of it the way you know the face of someone you love, the hairline crack in the plaster above the mantel, the way the third floorboard from the left always sang a half-step flat when you stepped on it. I thought about my father-in-law handing me tools from a folding chair. I thought about his face when the magazine article ran. Then I got up and drove to an antique jewelry dealer I had known for years through estate sale circles. I told him I was looking for something with interior space, a locket or brooch with enough depth behind the setting to conceal a small device. He found me a Victorian mourning brooch. Black enamel and seed pearls run a central oval, hinged at the back with just enough hollow space behind the front face. I knew someone who could work with small format audio and video equipment. I had met him doing documentation work for a historic preservation society. I called him that afternoon. 3 days later, I had what I needed. The dinner invitation came from my mother-in-law, handwritten on cardstock, delivered through my husband, who brought it to me with an expression that said he had already been softened on the topic. She wanted to clear the air, she wrote. She wanted to start fresh. She was making pot roast, my husband's favorite, and she hoped I would come and let her show that the family could be a family again. I read the card twice. Reconciliations, in my experience, come in 2 kinds. The first kind is genuine, and it arrives with discomfort, with the honest acknowledgement of what happened, with some demonstrated cost to the person who caused the harm. The second kind arrives too easily, too warmly, too soon after an escalation, dressed in exactly the right clothes for the occasion. It arrives with pot roast and handwritten notes and the careful staging of normalcy, and it wants something. I called my attorney and told her I was going. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me you're not going without a plan." I told her about the brooch. She was quiet again for a longer moment. Then she said, "Don't touch the wine." The house in Hilton Head was a coastal contemporary, all white walls and sliding glass, and the kind of tasteful minimalism that took significant money to achieve. My mother-in-law met us at the door in a cashmere wrap and genuine warmth, the performance polished to an invisible edge. My sister-in-law was in the kitchen, contributing to an atmosphere of domestic normalcy. Everything smelled of rosemary and roasting meat. My husband relaxed almost immediately. I watched it happen in his shoulders, the way they dropped, the way his voice changed register when he kissed his mother's cheek. This was still home to him in some fundamental way I couldn't touch. I smiled and said the house looked beautiful and sat down at the dining table. The conversation during dinner was careful and pleasant. My mother-in-law asked about my current projects. My sister-in-law mentioned a friend's new baby. My husband told a story about something that happened at work. We were a family having dinner, and it was almost convincing. Then my mother-in-law refilled my wine glass and said gently that she had been thinking and she wanted to propose something. She said she understood I had worked hard on the Hargrove house, and she respected that. She said she wasn't asking me to give anything up, just to consider a shared arrangement, a family LLC, something that would allow everyone to benefit and would protect me legally in the process. She looked at me with such transparent reasonableness that I felt a cold clarity move through me from the top of my skull downward. I said I would think about it. She smiled. My sister-in-law smiled. My husband looked relieved. And then the conversation moved, and I listened, and they forgot that I was listening. Or perhaps they had made a calculation that in this space, in their home, with my husband present and the wine poured and the pot roast on the plates, I was already neutralized. My mother-in-law mentioned the appraiser she had contacted. My sister-in-law said something about the timeline and a buyer who was interested if they moved before summer. My mother-in-law said quietly, more to my sister-in-law than to anyone else, that if the cooperative approach didn't work, they had already spoken to someone about documenting a pattern of instability, that the missing files from the office incident could be described differently, that my husband could attest to erratic behavior at home. She said it the way you say something you said before, practiced and certain. My husband had gone still beside me. I did not look at him. I pressed one finger lightly to the brooch at my collar and kept my face neutral and let them keep talking. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark and listened to my husband breathing beside me and thought about what I had heard and what I had recorded and what it meant and what came next. I also thought about the moment at the dinner table when he had gone still, when I had felt something shift in the air between us, and I did not yet know which direction he would fall when this was over. My attorney filed the documentation request the following morning. The hidden recording had captured enough to establish the outline of a coordinated effort to manipulate my husband's testimony in a potential competency proceeding. That was before we had even confirmed there would be a proceeding. We were, as my attorney said with satisfaction, ahead of the curve. Then the letter arrived, a formal petition requesting a judicial review of my fitness to manage significant inherited property, citing observable deterioration in judgment, volatile domestic behavior, and documented destruction of personal professional materials. It was filed by my mother-in-law and co-signed by my sister-in-law. Attached was a statement from my husband. I read his statement at my kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. It was 3 paragraphs. It described 3 incidents over the past several months in which I had, according to him, behaved in ways that concerned him. The incidents he described were real events, but they were bent. An argument I had raised about the office break-in became paranoid accusations without basis. A night when I had come home from the Hargrove house very late after a long work session became unexplained absences and disorientation about time. The moment I confronted him about the key to our home became an aggressive and frightening episode. I set the statement down on the table and sat with it for a while. I called my attorney. She'd already received the filing. She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm fine." "How soon can we respond?" There was a pause. She said, "You know we have the recording." I said, "I know, but I also need something else." I told her about the covenant clause my father-in-law had added to the deed, the one about documented attempts to coerce the heir into relinquishing title. I asked her whether the petition combined with the dinner recording would meet that threshold. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Oh, that's very good." The competency hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. I dressed carefully. I wore the brooch. I arrived early and sat in the back of the courtroom and watched the room fill. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law came in together. My mother-in-law composed, and my sister-in-law with her hands folded. They sat at the petitioner's table with their attorney, a man in an expensive suit who had clearly done this kind of proceeding before. My husband came in alone, sat 3 rows ahead of me, didn't look back. The petitioner's case took 40 minutes. Their attorney presented the statement from my husband and a letter from a psychologist who had, remarkably, formed a professional opinion about my mental state without ever meeting me, based entirely on the collateral reports provided by my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. The psychologist's letter used words like concerning patterns and difficulty with reality testing, and my mother-in-law cried, quietly and elegantly, at exactly the right moments. I sat with my hands folded and said nothing. My attorney let them finish. She let the judge review the documents. She let the room settle into what my mother-in-law probably believed was the moment before victory. Then my attorney stood up and said she had evidence she would like to present. She played the audio first, just audio, clearly recorded. 2 voices that the court reporter was asked to identify for the record. My mother-in-law and my sister-in-law in a private dinner conversation, discussing a plan to document a pattern of instability using a misrepresented description of a break-in they had evidently arranged themselves, and coordinating my husband's statement in advance. My mother-in-law's attorney was on his feet immediately. He said the recording was obtained without consent. My attorney noted calmly that South Carolina was a one-party consent state, and that I had been a party to the conversation. The judge asked my mother-in-law's attorney to sit down. Then my attorney said there was also video. The footage from the brooch camera wasn't perfect. It was dinner table level, faces partially obscured by candlelight, but the audio was clean and the visual was clear enough to show who was speaking and when, and the expressions on their faces while they said it. My mother-in-law watched herself on the small court screen with an expression I had not seen before on her, something young and frightened, the composure finally stripped completely. My sister-in-law put her hand over her mouth. My husband had turned in his seat and was looking at me for the first time all morning. I met his eyes and held them and didn't move my face. My attorney then presented a second piece of evidence. Security camera footage from our neighborhood, which she had requested from a homeowner 2 houses down, who had installed cameras covering the street. It showed a vehicle registered to my sister-in-law parked outside our house on the afternoon my office was entered. It showed my sister-in-law walking up our front path. It showed her leaving 23 minutes later. There was a long silence in the courtroom. The judge looked at the petitioner's table for a considerable amount of time. Then my attorney presented the deed and the protective covenant and asked the court to take judicial notice of its terms. The judge read it twice. Then he looked up and said that in light of the evidence presented, he was not only dismissing the competency petition, but entering a notation in the court record of apparent coordinated fraudulent filing, and referring the security footage and audio evidence to the county prosecutor's office for review. He said the covenant clause, given the documented coercive conduct, appeared to have been triggered, and that the relevant party should expect separate correspondence regarding the forfeiture of inheritance rights attached. My mother-in-law's attorney started to say something. The judge said he was finished, and that the petitioner should understand the seriousness of what the evidence had just established in open court. I sat in the back of the courtroom and pressed my fingers once more against the brooch, and then I took a breath and let it out slowly. After the hearing, in the corridor, my husband found me near the elevator. He looked the way people look when something they've been holding for a long time has just given way. Not relief exactly, more like the exhaustion that comes after a collapse. He said, "I didn't know about the break-in. I want you to know that." I looked at him. He was telling the truth about that specific thing. I believed him. The statement, though, the 3 paragraphs, those were his. He had bent the truth himself, without being asked to stage anything, and that was a different kind of thing. I said, "I know you didn't plan what they did, but you signed your name to a document that described me as unstable. You decided to do that." He didn't look away. He said, "I know." I said, "I need you to understand there's a difference between what your mother talked you into and what you chose. I can't sort that out for you." We stood in the corridor for a long moment with the sound of the courthouse around us, and then I stepped into the elevator alone. That was 6 months ago. My husband and I are still married. That is the honest answer to the question I know some of you are already forming. We are still married, but we are different. The way a bone is different after it breaks and heals, stronger in the specific place it broke, and more aware of itself. He spent 2 months in intensive therapy. He told his mother that he would not be attending her calls for a while. He has not signed anything without showing it to me first. It is not a redemption arc with a tidy bow. It is 2 people deciding, with full information, to keep trying. Some days that feels right, and some days I am still sorting through what I think about the 3 paragraphs. And he knows that, and he doesn't ask me to be done with it before I am. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law are facing a civil matter related to the fraudulent filing. The forfeiture clause was upheld in a separate proceeding. Whatever inheritance rights they had retained from the estate are gone. The Hargrove House received its historic preservation designation 4 months ago. The ground floor opened last month for its first artist residency. 6 women in various stages of rebuilding their careers after periods of financial control or emotional abuse, using the parlor and the back sun porch as studio space. On opening day, one of them stood in the front hallway looking up at the plaster medallion ceiling and said it felt like being inside something that had decided to survive. I thought about my father-in-law and his folding chair in the hallway, handing me tools. I kept the brooch. It sits in a small dish on my bathroom counter. The recording has been archived with my attorney. The way you archive something that taught you something important, not because you want to think about it every day, but because you want the record to exist. Before everything unfolded, the thing I was most afraid of was not the legal proceedings, or the competency hearing, or even the statement my husband signed. The thing I was most afraid of was the version of myself that would have stayed quiet to keep the peace, that would have signed whatever they put in front of me to stop the pressure, that would have dissolved the 4 years and the heart pine floors and the horsehair plaster into someone else's financial relief and called it keeping the family together. My father-in-law did not leave me that house because he thought I was the most deserving, or the most lovable, or the most connected to the family name. He left it to me because he had watched me spend 4 years learning the exact nature of what I was working with. Every hairline crack, every failed joint, every place where the surface looked solid, but the structure underneath needed rebuilding. He knew I would recognize a forgery. He knew I would not stop until the real thing was restored. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I want to know who's out there.